Caiaphas was the Jewish high priest who served in Jerusalem from about 18 to 36 AD. Protecting his own power and preserving public order were now his highest priorities. And Caiaphas knew that Jesus must die.
For many followers of Jesus, his death and resurrection form an essential part of their faith. However, a new analysis of Jesus' time on earth has revealed a disturbing truth. This discovery has to do with the man who was the high priest at the time, High Priest Caiaphas.
Caiaphas, the high priest, made his position clear to the religious authorities.
He was the high priest who condemned Jesus to death. Just before his own death, Caiaphas shed new knowledge that deeply affected our view of Jesus' life and resurrection. What was Caiaphas' life as a high priest, and what truth is embedded in his revelation? Join us as we delve in. Why Caiaphas hated Jesus. Joseph ben Caiaphas was a Sadducee. This sect of Jews as a whole fulfilled various political, social, and religious roles, including maintaining the temple in Jerusalem. During Jesus' ministry, Caiaphas had just taken over the role of high priest from his father-in-law Annas. Caiaphas profoundly impacted the history of Roman rule over the Jews. From the beginning, Caiaphas being selected to serve as high priest was a political manipulation by the Roman Empire, which found it impossible to control the former priest. Annas and all his sons who should have succeeded him didn't serve as high priests for long. They were replaced as soon as it became apparent they wouldn't conform to being puppets to the Roman rulers.
Under his leadership, the Roman Empire reaches its greatest territorial extent, 2 million square miles.
But Caiaphas' ascension to power would be different. What was most surprising was that he would retain the position for the next 20 years, staying much longer than his predecessors. That's not all. Caiaphas was hardly a pushover for the Roman Empire. He had a unique ability to navigate the complexities of his role. He could perform his religious authority while balancing his allegiance to the Roman government. His time progressed with little upheavals from both ends until Jesus' earthly ministry.
Lay not up for yourselves treasures upon earth, where moth and rust doth corrupt, and where thieves break through and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust doth corrupt, and where thieves do not break through nor steal.
What changed, and why did Caiaphas and the religious authorities seek to annihilate Jesus? Jesus' teachings and deeds unsettled Caiaphas. A misunderstood belief had become widespread that the Messiah would be a violent ruler ready to destroy Roman authority. These beliefs stem from Jesus' audience misinterpreting the spiritual lessons he imparted. Comments like, "I am the way, the truth, and the life," were believed to mean Jesus was probably planning a military takeover or revolt. This news of propaganda soon got to Caiaphas' ears. Caiaphas, not knowing they were false stories, became greatly agitated and began plotting to end Jesus' life. He eventually succeeded, and Jesus was hanged on a torture stake. But the aftermath of their quest was something they couldn't have anticipated. The aftermath. Even though Caiaphas and other religious leaders tried to move back to their regular routines after Jesus' death and resurrection, he knew in his heart that he had done something terribly wrong. Ever since he heard that Jesus had been resurrected, he had been experiencing horrific nightmares. Narrations of the events that occurred during the time of Jesus' death filled him with dread. Stories of the sky darkening during the day when Jesus was hanged on the cross. When he eventually died, the temple curtain ripped into two. To make the situation even more shocking, the resurrected Jesus emerged from the tomb alive. All these stories began to fill Caiaphas with a rising sense of darkness. These feelings of guilt were overwhelming. Caiaphas failed in his role as a high priest. It was his duty to certify the prophesied messianic candidates. However, Caiaphas allowed politics and jealousy to make him oblivious to the truth. He was now having nightmares and was filled with deep regret for killing the much-anticipated Anointed One. After realizing his grave error in judgment, he tried to make up for his sins by studying significant Hebrew predictions of what would occur following the Messiah's death. But the passages from the scriptures did not ease his troubled conscience. He kept seeing visions of Jesus around him, accusing him of condemning him to death. He was losing his mind. Many times he will break down into tears, loudly confessing his role in the capturing and false judgment of Jesus. One day it got to a point where he couldn't take it anymore. Caiaphas removed his glittering high priestly garments, left the room, and walked out of the temple. As the council struggled to process this shocking revelation of Caiaphas's role in Jesus' death, Jonathan, his longtime subordinate, was quickly elected Jerusalem's next high priest. According to the Jewish historian Josephus, this happened in 36 AD. The disgraced former high priest Caiaphas withdrew to his estate and lived out the rest of his days alone, often sobbing for his reckless deeds against the Messiah. In modern times, many feel that the biblical rendition of Caiaphas's involvement in Jesus' death and even Jesus' life might have been fiction. However, some interesting discoveries by archaeologists have revealed shocking insights into Caiaphas. Let's explore further. Archaeologists recently discovered a first-century mansion on Jerusalem's Mount Zion. Based on their findings, they believe it may have belonged to Caiaphas, the high priest who condemned Jesus to death.
My God, why have you forsaken me? Finished!
This team of archaeologists, led by Shimon Gibson and James Tabor, learnt that according to an ancient Byzantine tradition, Caiaphas was said to relocate to the general area of the excavation site. This, coupled with the elaborate features of the house, led them to believe it must have belonged to Caiaphas. The features of this house were not standard during that time. A 3-pit oven, a private walk-in ritual pool, and a separate bathroom were luxuries. Some people at this time hadn't even seen, much less owned one at that period. Pools were so uncommon at the time only 3 of them existed. 2 of them were discovered in Herod's palaces at Jericho and Mada. The kinds of artifacts found at the site support the claims that the mansion must have belonged to a wealthy person. A cache of murex shells, from which the highly sought-after rich purple dye was extracted for religious garments. The disgraceful repercussions of Caiaphas's condemnation of Jesus to death are significant proof of Jesus' resurrection. Even before his birth, many prophecies in the Old Testament pointed at his birth and his life. One of them is so shocking. This is an aspect of the prophecy concerning Jesus that Caiaphas would have known. If he had paid careful attention to it, his life might have turned out differently. What was this prophecy? Events leading up to his death. Jesus' mission to come to earth was predetermined. The New Testament has a verse that states he was meant to give his life to save humanity. Although Jesus was well aware of the circumstances surrounding his impending sacrifice, including the timing and individuals involved, there was a twist. The Gospel of Mark explains that Jesus also warned of his betrayal. He said the Son of Man would go just as it is written about him, but woe to that man who betrays the Son of Man. It would be better for him if he had not been born. This moving declaration warns of the approaching treachery that would lead to Jesus' death, of which Caiaphas was a key player. As in Caiaphas's case, the repercussions for the betrayer were dire. But there was another participant involved in this treachery. Given the complex circumstances of those plotting to harm Jesus, they needed someone close to him. Judas Iscariot was among the closest followers of Jesus. Judas struggled with personal issues and a greedy need for material wealth. This greed put him in a state of mind that he was quick to believe rumors about Jesus being a mastermind for a military takeover. Judas gave in to temptation and betrayed Jesus for personal gain. He is known for his act of treachery, which manifested as a deceptive kiss until today. His kiss informed the religious authorities that Jesus was among his followers. They captured Jesus and led him away, laying the groundwork for the subsequent events that would permanently change the path of history. Jesus' detention didn't follow the standard procedure. Typically, after being taken into custody by the temple guards, he should be taken to the temple jail until the entire Sanhedrin convened.
The Sanhedrin was a group of religious leaders who appear many times in the New Testament, often clashing with Jesus and even each other.
But in a strange turn of events that Caiaphas had masterminded, Jesus was taken straight to Caiaphas's home in Jerusalem. This was wrong on so many levels. First, it happened on the eve of Passover, a holy night in the Jewish calendar that was spent celebrating with family. Instead, according to Mark's account of the evening, spontaneous summons of condemnation about Jesus quickly came up, suggesting that Caiaphas was keen to wrap up Jesus' case quickly and discreetly without the entire Sanhedrin. Even if the Sanhedrin had been congregated, they cannot pass the death judgment on a person even if found guilty. They needed to wait overnight to pass the sentence, and then all trials had to take place in the Hall of Hewn Stones, the official place for trials in the temple. Here, witnesses will be brought forward to testify against the accused. All the witnesses' words had to be of one accord, otherwise they would be punished severely. But in the case of Jesus, he was taken to Caiaphas's house, where the witnesses' words were contradictory, and yet they went unpunished. After years of managing his role as the high priest and going without contradicting the Roman rulers, this will be the first time Caiaphas acted corruptly to uphold the Romans' cause. He knew if he waited for the Sanhedrin to gather and they refused to approve of finding Jesus guilty, he would be in a tight corner. He may ask the Roman authorities for assistance. However, the Sanhedrin has always preferred to manage their affairs independently of the Romans. He had to act fast. Assessing the situation, Caiaphas overflogged the minor offenses the eyewitnesses pointed to. One said they heard him declare that he would build another temple not made with hands in 3 days. While this might have been provocative, it was hardly an offense punishable by death. Overreacting to the situation, the high priest ripped off his garments and questioned why the witnesses were still required to testify. Herod Antipas, who was a governor at the time, tried to intercede, saying he didn't see anything wrong in what Jesus had done that warranted a death sentence. But seeing the influence Caiaphas already had over the crowd, his hands were tied. He had to side with him and declare the innocent man guilty. After the sentence, Jesus was handed over to the crowd and led to Golgotha, where he was crucified. As life drained out of him, the country fell into darkness. Jesus said his last words, which included the moving prayer. He said, "Father, I commit my spirit into your hands." At this point, Jesus breathed his last, signifying the completion of his selfless journey for humanity. Although there were prophecies concerning Jesus' betrayal and eventual death, Caiaphas and Judas Iscariot allow materialistic greed and hunger for power to push them to become the key players in an unfolding prophetic event. What happened to Caiaphas following Jesus' death and how it led to his demise is a historic event that has a lot of lessons for our time. Did the archaeological discovery of High Priest Caiaphas's house after he left the temple change your viewpoint of Caiaphas's role in the biblical Jesus story? Let's say he didn't go through that act, but things might have played differently. But then, it wouldn't be in accordance with God's will, would it? So it's important we look to him as an important figure instead. That aside, it doesn't mean that Caiaphas didn't find Jesus irritable. As a matter of fact, the Testament of Caiaphas itself tells the story of an author who was tormented by having to deal with Jesus on several occasions. And it didn't really help matters, having to know that this man was followed by many followers who heeded his teachings. Being that Jesus grew rather dominant in his teachings in Jerusalem at the time, he wasn't just converting people. Apparently, he was also having an influence on the members of the Council of Sanhedrin, and Caiaphas wasn't particularly happy about that. For one, he was the head of the council, and he found Jesus' teachings not just blasphemous, but one to undermine his authority in the council. Still, things would have been a little much easier if the man was just political and hateful. Caiaphas wasn't just a distasteful man. It turns out that he was a rather complex man who struggled with his conscience, and he wasn't really willing to see the evolution of the gospel teachings and scriptures. These were all the traits that Jesus brought with him while he preached the gospel to the people. Eventually, we all know how the man took action to prevent Jesus from teaching. However, what do you make of the aftermath of the crucifixion? Clearly, a whole lot of things happened, but we are going to pay attention to what Caiaphas saw coming. In Caiaphas's testimony, the man gave quite a terrifying description of how things would play out after the crucifixion of Jesus. And it so happened to be that they were all from a vision, in a dream which had haunted him for a while. In the dream, Caiaphas saw not just the resurrection of Jesus, but also the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem.
In 586 BC, the Babylonian military led by King Nebuchadnezzar succeeded in breaking a 2-year-long siege and destroyed much of the city of Jerusalem, her walls, palaces, and most devastatingly, the Temple of Solomon.
What's more, the destruction of the temple caused a great amount of suffering for the people, and they were bound to suffer torment for a long while. Being one of those visions that caused Caiaphas to be tormented in his life, the whole thing made him consider if condemning Jesus to death was the right choice. But then, it was a little too late to be having regrets. The deed was done already, so he was left to watch as things unfolded. Talking about the unfolding events, you'd agree that everything did play out just as Caiaphas foresaw in his dream. Jesus didn't just rise on the third day, the temple was also destroyed. Being one of those prophecies from the past, this account on the Caiaphas Testament goes a long way to show just how significant the discovery is to the Jews and Christians. Christians are reminded of the prophecy that was foretold, which says that Jesus, the Son of God, would resurrect on the third day in accordance with his word. Then, for the Jews, it sort of brings the entire religious politics to the limelight. We are talking about that which had to do with the Council of Sanhedrin, the Romans, and their roles in portraying the old gospel to the people. What's more, it also brings all the internal affairs of the temple to focus. What kind of religious authority do you think Caiaphas and his fellow council members were practicing back in the day? Using the testament that was discovered, we are about to humanize Caiaphas as he walks through the halls of the temple. Stick around and go nowhere. The 1st century Judea. During the time of Jesus, the religious authority within the Jewish temple was a little complex. It wasn't just one being overseen by a certain hierarchy, it was one which had the clutches of politics deeply involved in it. And at the top of it all was the high priest, Caiaphas.
The sun's rays began to pierce through the narrow streets of Jerusalem, casting long shadows that seemed to hint at the intricate web of power and politics that underpinned the city.
For a high priest, it's safe to say that Caiaphas was mostly influenced by the politics of Judea rather than religion. And if we are to consider a lot of things, if he wasn't into politics, he might not have been able to attain the position he did in the country. As a key player in politics, Caiaphas's major role was to serve as a liaison between the Jewish people and the Roman occupiers. His primary responsibility was to maintain religious order while also ensuring the stability of Roman rule. Being a delicate role that balanced power in the religious and political sects, it made Caiaphas one of the most powerful men in the land. As a matter of fact, Caiaphas was not appointed by the clerics, nor was he appointed by the people. Instead, he was put in position by the Roman prefect, Valerius Gratus. This goes a long way to show how the Romans admired his political skills. Being that the Romans appointed him, Caiaphas was once caught in a position where he was uncertain whether to please the Romans or his people, the Jews. It was as he grew in a position that he began to navigate the competing interests of Jewish factions while also pleasing the Romans, whose military and presence overshadowed the land. Still, several times, there were conflicts between the two factions, and he was always caught in the middle. There were times when it was quite problematic to make a decision. And even times when he did, he was mostly hated by his own people, the Jews. You could say that each time worse came to worse, he always had the Romans' interest at heart. It was all out of loyalty for Caiaphas, and he was willing to do anything to retain his position as head of the council and as a liaison. While you might consider Caiaphas's approach to be partial and distasteful, owing to the fact that he was a Jew, you should know that his tenure was peaceful. Yes. There might have been a few mild disputes within the factions now and then, but they never made the Romans resort to raising their swords against the Jews. The Jews who were enjoying peace had the liberty to run their affairs without trouble, and they had the temple all to themselves. So, it was a win for Caiaphas, not minding the several crooked approaches he took to ensure the peace. Still, let's not underscore the tension that filled the air at the time. Indeed, Caiaphas might have helped ensure peace in Judea, but it doesn't change the fact that the lands were ruled mainly by fear. Back then, the Jews had to live by the rules of the Romans, and they didn't have a say in political affairs. What's more, they had to pay heavy taxes to the Romans.
Taxation in the Roman Empire. Taxes were levied in several forms: land tax based on property values, poll tax on individuals, customs duties on imported and exported goods, and tributes from conquered territories.
And failure to do that made the soldiers resort to harsher approaches. It was exactly like a country being dominated by foreigners. While they might have coexisted with the daily living of the Jews, it was evident that the actual owners of the land were uneasy, and they sought complete freedom. That being the case, it wasn't long before all of the Jews had a cause to pray. One of the major prayer points of the Jews was for God to send a Messiah. In accordance with the scriptures, they believed that a Savior would come to liberate them from their chains. That way, they'd be free from the oppression of the Romans. It got to a time when this very prayer became their last piece of hope. At some point, it wasn't just the core belief of regular Jews. This hope was now affecting the actions of the religious leaders. It gets even more interesting. Apparently, within the Jewish community itself, there are quite a couple of groups that have their own interpretation of what the religious laws should be like. Each and every one of these groups had their own vision of what the future of Jewish people would be like. One of the factions that were very much outspoken was the Pharisees. They weren't just influential, they were very strict in their laws and beliefs. And while they went about their affairs, they never hesitated to call out the faulters as blasphemous. Looking at the scriptures, one of the people that the Pharisees locked horns with is Jesus. Apparently, they didn't just see Jesus' teachings as blasphemous, they also found his interpretations of Scripture completely arbitrary to what they know. For the Pharisees, you can say that their focus on purity was applaudable. However, they were the most rigid when it came to matters pertaining to the Scriptures. On the other hand, the Sadducees were more of an aristocratic group that held a very important political power. They controlled the affairs of the temple and the priesthood. Of course, you should know by now that this is where Caiaphas fell under. Like Caiaphas, the other Sadducees did not believe in the resurrection or in the afterlife. So, they'd have disputes with the Pharisees very much often on the subject. The fact that they were seen as collaborators in the mishap that fell on Judea made them hated by the Jewish population. Regardless, they were the group most favored by the Romans in the country, mainly because of how close Caiaphas were to the ruling body. The Sadducees' focus was on maintaining the temple as the center of religious life, and they were majorly concerned with the proper execution of rituals and sacrifices rather than the more spiritual or ethical concerns that the Pharisees were after. Still, yet another group was the Essenes.
Picture this. Over 2,000 years ago, a group known as the Essenes existed. Tucked away near the Dead Sea, they lived by rules that still perplex us today, preserved in the famous Dead Sea Scrolls.
You might not have heard of them because they preferred to live isolated lives in communities near the Dead Sea. Right there, they practiced what's known as an ascetic lifestyle as they waited for the coming of the Messiah. The Essenes isolated themselves because they thought that the Pharisees and Sadducees had polluted the temple with their ideologies. So they aimed for a direct and pure relationship with God. The Essenes are thought to be the group behind the Dead Sea Scrolls, which have provided modern scholars with a deeper understanding of what Jewish life is all about. Let's just say we do owe them a vote of thanks for all the knowledge they have shared with us. Lest we forget, there is also the troublesome bunch, the zealots. They were a revolutionary group that sought to overthrow Roman rule by force. They believed that the only way to achieve Jewish independence was through violent rebellion, and their fierce opposition to Roman occupation made them a constant threat to both the Roman authorities and Jewish leaders like Caiaphas. Indeed, a couple of them did believe in the coming of the Messiah, but they weren't about to sit down and tolerate the daily oppression that the Romans were dishing out. Some loved them for their bravery, while others thought that their revolutionary approaches only angered the Romans. Due to the radical approach and methods of the zealots, there was a kind of division within the Jewish community. Talk about the several factions and divisions. You'd agree that's a lot, right? However, against this backdrop of religious factions and Roman occupation, Jesus began his ministry. As a matter of fact, his teachings attracted large crowds, and his message of the kingdom spread to meet the many who were steadfast on the teachings of the Pharisees, the corruption of the Sadducees, and the violence of zealots. It didn't matter which faction anyone belonged to, everyone was touched. As Jesus preached about a different kingdom free from the corruption of politics and the military, he also preached about love, service, and forgiveness. Sadly, the Sadducees weren't particularly happy about this, and they saw it as a challenge to their authority. Looking back at the state of things when the Jews were yearning for a Messiah, many believed that Jesus was the one to deliver them from Roman rule. However, Jesus' mission was different from what they had in mind. He never intended to lead a political revolt, nor was he going to protest against the Romans. Sadly, that wasn't what Caiaphas thought. Being that Jesus pulled a massive crowd wherever he went, the high priest was scared that he would incite a rebellion with the zealots. This was what led Caiaphas to make a hasty decision as a means to restore order between the Jews and the Romans. Eventually, this decision of his would go ahead to have profound consequences, not just for the Jews, but the entire Christian religion as a whole. That aside, you might probably be trying to see things from Caiaphas's perspective, wondering how much of an impact the Testament and his rule of authority had in the way things turned out in the Christian religion. Well, if you are in that position, we have a few words of clarity for you. So why don't you chill as we let you on some pieces of scriptural wisdom, the alternate perspective of the key players in Jesus' crucifixion.
Father, forgive them. They know not what they do.
There's no doubt that by now, we've been able to portray Caiaphas as one of the major key players in the crucifixion of Jesus. However, do you know someone else we might have kept out of the spotlight? You are right. That's Judas Iscariot. This man was the person who sold Jesus out for him to be crucified. However, when all things are carefully looked at, these men might have been more of the instruments of salvation than the villains we portray them to be. That said, you shouldn't look at them from the traditional perspective this time. Instead, let's try looking at them without any blame whatsoever. For starters, from the Caiaphas Testament, we have been able to deduce that man is not just a power-hungry high priest, but also a man who is grappling with the tension between preserving religious order and worrying about Roman rule. Furthermore, his testament reveals a person deeply torn between his duty to maintain peace for the Jews and the significance that Jesus posed during his era. Looking at things, you'd see that he might not necessarily have been a political pawn, but one who was looking for stability in an era of uncertainties. Judas's story gets pretty interesting when you get to know that there is a gospel about him, that which is known as the Gospel of Judas. Even though the author of this Gnostic writing is still unknown, there are several clerics who believe that Judas himself wrote the Gospel. The Gospel of Judas presents a spontaneous image of Judas, who is often looked at as the most vilified figure to someone different. Rather than the traitor who sold Jesus for 30 pieces of silver, Judas is looked at as the disciple with the most important divine mission in the Gospel. According to his text, his betrayal was not an act of greed or malice, but a necessary step in fulfilling Jesus' request, a request that none other of the disciples could have undertaken. In a way, it makes sense. If there was one person Jesus trusted the most, it was Judas. There is a chance that he might have understood deeper mysteries than the others did. So, selling off Jesus might have been for the fulfillment of the prophecy, rather than for gain. As such, this version of Judas paints him as a person who faced tragedy, constantly being conflicted in his search for truth that he believed to be the will of his teacher. Talk about being unfortunate, right? This takes us straight to one of the most peaceful factions in Jewish history, the Essenes. This faction was exactly the true believers of prophecy. Their livelihood, which was revealed through the Dead Sea Scrolls, showed that while they were engaged in spiritual matters, they pretty much let every other thing play out according to God's will. Their writings offer a vision of messianic hope that rivaled other Jewish sects, including the Pharisees and Sadducees. The Essenes were not simply retreating from society, they were actively seeking truth and purity, believing that the corruption of the temple and its leaders like Caiaphas was a sign that divine intervention was imminent. Their complex views on community, prophecy, and righteousness suggest they were not outliers, but key players in shaping religious thought during this important era. And they did quite a whole lot to receive Jesus. As a matter of fact, Amongst a few theological leaders, there are those who believe that Jesus' traits and character were all gotten from the Essenes, talking about traits of humility, charity, communal sharing, and a few others. It's possible that Jesus might have adopted their ways before he got baptized by John the Baptist for his journey. In the end, Jesus' favorite of places to minister was in the wilderness areas Essenes inhabited. Some believe he even cured their sick, and their practices like immersion had roots in his baptism. It's easy to see their spirits commingling, still briefly, before each marched the paths destiny set. What do you think about the discovery of Caiaphas' testament? Do you think his actions were that of a desperate man who was hungry for power, or did God himself orchestrate it? We'd love you to share your opinion in the comments section. If you enjoyed the video, make sure you like, share, and subscribe to the channels. Also, click the next video shown on your screen. You will enjoy it.